It took me some time to go through this book called Wild Fictions Essays by the famous Indian Bengali writer Amitav Ghosh. I picked the book randomly as one of the top non-fiction books of 2025. I had never read or even heard of Amitav Ghosh before. I now realize how ignorant I had been. Now I consider myself lucky, for the book Wild Fictions by Amitav was a feast for me. Wild Fictions is a thought-provoking collection of essays by the master novelist Amitav Ghosh, highlighting the issues around climate change, migration, and colonialism. So naturally, I looked up Amitav Ghosh, and indeed, he was the recipient of the Padma Shri, one of India's highest honors, in 2007. And in 2018, he won the 54th Gyanpith Award, India's highest literary honor. And now I know why. Wild Fictions is a wonderful book which brings together Amitav Ghosh's extraordinary writings on subjects that have obsessed him over the last 25 years: literature and language, climate change and environment, human lives, travel and discoveries. The range of topics he has covered in his collection of essays is simply brilliant, and the language is such a breeze. While reading the book, I had this peculiar feeling that I was able to radically increase the speed of my reading while going through the work of Amitav Ghosh and still absorb everything. Thanks to Wild Fictions, I also got introduced to the other works of Amitav Ghosh. From the fiction side, the Ibis trilogy, The Circle of Reason, The Glass Palace, and many more. And from the non-fiction side, Smoke and Ashes, The Nutmeg's Curse, and In an Antique Land. I'm sure it would be fascinating to read them all. In his book Wild Fictions, Amitav gives reference from his works and also tells how he prepared himself to write all these books by actually traveling to various parts of the world like Egypt and China. Now then, make no mistake, the book is not for everybody. The book is primarily for intellectuals who like to think about things, reason them out, and then think about things again. Not everybody is like that, and not everybody needs to be like that, and there's no dishonor in that. Hence, I would stick my neck out and say that Wild Fictions is a book for scholars, writers, intellectuals, professors, and in general, thinker community. If you're not a thinker, you would find the book a drag, except for the parts where war stories are told. But then, you would never be able to reach those parts of the book if you're not an intellectual at heart. The whole book comprises of 26 chapters, and the chapters are organized into 6 sections. The first section is called The Climate Change and Environment, where, as the name suggests, the author gives a fascinating analysis of climate change and even correlates it to the human migrations. It talks about cyclones and the folly of trying to create a new tourism complex in the Sundarbans. There is a moving and a harrowing account of the predicament of a person who lost everything, including his family, in the tsunami which hit the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in 2004. This section makes a fascinating read, but my favorite section is the next one, and that is the second section called Witnesses. This section consists of multiple chapters which has absolutely captivating and engrossing accounts of the experiences of the Indian soldiers from the First World War. I mean, how many times do we get a chance to read about the experience of Indians in the First World War? So this section is worth its weight in gold. When you read the accounts of the soldiers when the British Army was defeated in their attempt to capture Baghdad, things become numb around you as you're surrounded by bullets whisking around and wounds and hunger and disease and death. You realize what a folly it is to sit in our drawing rooms listening to fawning commentators on TV declaring a war on our neighboring countries. But that's a different conversation altogether. Equally fascinating is a third section called Travel and Discovery. Here, Amitav Ghosh brings out his passion to travel to far and distant places, learn about people, and only then write his fiction instead of just belting something completely imaginary. It is this effort of Amitav that brings out the authenticity in his fiction works. The author describes how he went to Oxford from Delhi University on a scholarship to study social anthropology. You feel his passion when he discloses, and I quote, "My dream was of writing fiction, but like many an aspiring novelist, I felt I lacked the necessary richness of experience. The writers I admired, V.S. Naipaul, James Baldwin, and others, had gone out into the world and watched it go by. I wanted no less for myself. The scholarship was a godsend because it allowed me to choose where I wanted to go, and in my case, that was Egypt. Unquote. I mean, how many of us would choose to go to a place like Egypt given a choice, and that too in a small village there in the governorate of Beira near the town of Damanhur? And that became the basis of his book, In an Antique Land. People spoke Arabic there, so Amitav did learn Arabic, but it is remarkable that he mentions that Hindi film songs were known to the people there, and when all other efforts at communication broke down, they would burst into a Hindi song. Now that is vicarious living for us. He describes how curious were the people there about the cows being considered holy in India. Some people even asked him if he had ever considered transferring his allegiance to a camel instead. It is hilarious how he feigned to be an expert at the water pumps exported from India to Egypt because he was deemed to be an expert at those machines, being an Indian, while he himself confesses that he was one of those people who is hard put to tell a spanner from a hammer or a sprocket from a gasket. And that's the beauty of this book in general. For many pages, the author is fascinating you with his exposition of the important concepts in general. And the next moment, he takes you to a lived experience which connects the abstract with the tangible. And then you keep marveling at what you have laid your hands on and say, right, no wonder this guy has won all those awards. The fourth section is a short one called Narratives with just 3 essays. The first one about the Indian undergarment banyan or the West, which was published in the book called Dress, an anthology celebrating clothes and style by Vogue India no less. The author goes on to recount the 9/11 tragedy, telling how it affected the couple of Nicole and Frank. Frank was the construction manager of the World Trade Center and how he lost his life trying to save others because he knew the most about the building. He includes an essay as the last chapter about his favorite topic of environment, this time the forest preservations, and introduces us to the legend of Bon Bibi, the legendary lady of the forest, dubbed as a guardian spirit of the forests and venerated both by the Hindus and the Muslims, residents of the Sundarbans. The fifth section, called Conversations, discusses amongst other things the work of Shashi Tharoor called An Era of Darkness in a fascinating way. But what stood out for me in this section is a chapter called Provincializing Europe, a correspondence. In this chapter, Amitav Ghosh reproduces a series of emails that were exchanged between him and Dipesh Chakrabarti about Dipesh's book Provincializing Europe, where Dipesh mainly argues that European thought has been treated as a universal standard for modernity, which has historically marginalized the experiences of other regions. Amitav essentially does a critical review and analysis of the points made in the book and sends it out to Dipesh, who then replies back, and the emails keep getting exchanged. It is fascinating how two brilliant minds argue with each other on the various concepts, and you get to realize that they are operating at a different intellectual plane of existence. And you immediately realize why in 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named Amitav Ghosh as one of the most important global thinkers of the preceding decade. But you do realize one more thing watching the emails, and that is that even famous authors are vulnerable to heavy criticism and ripping apart of their ideas by other experts, and clearly there's a lot of pride at stake. So when these authors put their pen to paper, they cannot do it casually. There has to be a lot of research as well as conviction, whether they are writing fiction or non-fiction. It is not easy out there for these intellectual authors. The last section is called Presentations, which were a series of blog posts written by Amitav, where he describes his travels to Egypt and how it culminated into his writing of the book In an Antique Land. There's also a fascinating chapter where he is apparently addressing the students of IIT Kharagpur and brilliantly brings out the inequity that can be created by technology. And finally, the last chapter is about A.K. Ramanujan, who was one of the foremost writers and intellectuals of the 20th century, and how glad the author was when he came to know that he had written a few lines about his second novel, The Shadow Lines. He regretted that he could never meet A.K. Ramanujan in person. Overall, a wonderful book. I almost got a feeling that Amitav Ghosh talks about his chosen topics just like Raghuram Rajan does about the economy. Clearly, both of them are brilliant minds. Question is, are Indians taking advantage of the works of Amitav Ghosh? I myself was ignorant about Amitav Ghosh and his works, but now I would probably start with the Ibis trilogy from him. In the meantime, you should certainly catch up with a collection of essays in this book called Wild Fictions by Amitav Ghosh.